Happy Feature Friday, all my quilting friends. It's so great to have you guys back here with me. I hope you all have had a wonderful week. I know I have, and I'm looking forward to the weekend ahead. It is time for us to finish up this whole cloth quilt project so that I can then get started on working on the applique that's going to go on top of it. So what I have planned for today is to fill in that center section where the applique is actually going to go. And I want to use my quilt layout guide that's available on our mid and top of the line robotic system. So I'm going to show you guys how I plan on doing that, and hopefully everything will work out and we can get this finished. Let me turn you around. And here we are with our fabric. So we have done our cornerstones with our sunflower, our borders with our swirls and pearls. And now we have to take care of this wide section here in the middle that my applique work is going to go on. So what I plan on doing is filling in this whole area with just a open edge to edge design. So I'm going to show you guys how I plan on setting that up, and we'll get started. Now here on my display, you can see that I've got my safe area set, and that is ready to go. But now we need to add a layout box to represent our space that we're going to work with. So I have my layout highlighted here on the left-hand side, and we're going to come over here to the right-hand side and hit our plus sign. And now I can set the first point of my pattern box. I am going to set the first point of my pattern box as the inside of this little corner here where my borders and my inner area meet. So I'm going to hover my needle over that. And I'm going to hit my plus sign. And then I'm going to do this as kind of a 2-point process because this whole area is going to get filled. So I'm just going to move my machine down to the bottom right corner. I'm going to back it up just a little bit. I'm hovering just inside of my new space that I want to work with, just over the border. So I'm going to have that lined up there, and I am going to hit my check mark. And now my robotic system has created that whole area for me that we are going to work within. So the next thing I'm going to do is a little bit different from what we normally do. We normally go directly to our patterns and choose something to fill in, but this time I'm going to go to Edit. That's up here on the left-hand side of our display. I'm going to hit Edit, and that comes over here to the right and gives us all our wonderful editing features. I'm going to use my quilt layout guide, which is this button here. It's a little bit different in color. It's more of a light green, and then it's got a white box with black arrows in it. So we're going to highlight that. And when that's highlighted, it turns white with an orange arrows. And we have all kinds of things that show up across the bottom of our display. And I know I've done this before in a Feature Friday video, but it does have quilt length, number of passes, row spacing, top binding, bottom binding, quilt shrinkage. We've got an auto scale, and we also have a full layout guide to look at. So we've got all kinds of features down here, and we're going to use a lot of them. But the first one we're going to use is our little file folder here. This one is where we find our patterns. So I am going to open that up, and we get our full pattern list here. So we can scroll through our patterns like normal to choose something, but I did already choose a design. So I'm actually going to go over to my recent tab and find the design that I want to work with. And it is this one right here. It's called Ribbon Swirls E2E. So it is an edge to edge design. I'm going to highlight that and hit my green check mark to bring it into my quilt layout space. And you can see that it is much larger than my little orange box. Let me move my crosshairs out of the way so you can see the bottom line. So we have a little bit of work to do here, and I have my editing features available to me on the right-hand side, so we're going to go ahead and work with that. But the first thing I want to do is mirror image this. I think I would be happier if this little kind of straight line down here was at the top and this swirl was at the bottom. I'm just being picky about what my design looks like, and I'm just going to flip this over. So I'm going to come over to the right hand side of my display, and I'm going to use my mirror image button here. That is my top to bottom or right side up, upside down one. And when I hit that, it is going to turn my design upside down in the other direction. And now I've got that little line at the top of my pattern box instead of at the bottom. And I think I'm going to like that a little bit better. Now I want to make sure that I fill in more of my space. So I'm going to go over here to my repeat button at the very top. So that's your little box with arrows coming out and your plus sign. And when I hit that and it highlights, I've got all of my repeat features here. So I want to give us a couple more repeats across so that I've got my space filled in. I think maybe 3 will do it. Yeah, because this comes way outside my pattern box. So when we scale it down, I think it'll look nice. So I think I'll go with 3 repeats. I'm going to come to my scale feature. And I'm going to hit my auto scale button and see what that looks like when it's all tucked in there. And let's pull that out so you guys can see the whole thing. I think that looks nice. The ribbons didn't get distorted. They're still pretty and curvy, so I think I can work with this. I like that a lot. So let's go back to our repeat function, because the next thing I want to think about is I'm going to be nesting this design, and this has big open spaces here. So I'm going to need to work with my row spacing. And if you remember, let me click back over to our quilt layout guide. Row spacing is something that we have to work with. So I'm going to go into my repeat function and work with my spacing. I've got my spacing row here available. I'm going to work with my spacing so that we can get that determined here in our editing. So I'm going to add another row vertically. So I've got 2 rows now. And as you can see, I definitely have to work with that spacing because there is a lot of space between those 2 rows. So I'm going to work with my spacing here, and I'm just going to hit my minus button just 1 click at a time until I get those rows a little bit closer and where I think it looks a little bit better nested. I think I like it there, and my spacing is at -1.8. So I think that looks really good. So what I'm going to do is now erase this second row that I put on here because I don't need it right now. But it's going to take this -1.8 and transfer that over to our quilt layout guide. So I'm going to hit my minus here, and it's removed that extra row. And we still look good here in our box, but when I come to my quilt layout guide again, it has now put that -1.8 in my row spacing. So now I know all my nesting is going to look really nice when I move forward with stitching out my design. The next thing we need to worry about is our quilt length. My quilt length is not 72 inches long. It's actually 44 inches. That's how big the inside of this space measures when this quilt is all rolled out. It is 44 inches. So we are going to touch on the 72. I get my little keypad available for me, and I'm going to change the 72 to a 44 because that's how long my space actually is. And when I did that, you might have noticed that my number of passes has changed. So it is calculating on the quilt length how many passes of my design that the robotic system needs to make to fill in that space. Now 4.8 may sound great, but I want a full number of passes so I don't get just a portion that will stitch outside of my space. I want full rows. I want them completed. I don't want anything stitching outside of my area because then it'll end up in one of my borders. So I'm gonna open up my number of passes, and I want 5 full passes. And when I do 5 full passes, it's actually shrunk my design up just a little bit in my quilt box. It's recalculated that width for me. So instead of filling my whole box, it's just making it a little bit smaller so that we can get a complete 5 passes in there. My row spacing is still set at -1.8. Now I don't have a top binding or a bottom binding to worry about, so I'm not going to put anything in there. And as far as quilt shrinkage goes, I'm not actually going to put anything in there. I have a very thin batting, as you can see. This is not thick at all, so I don't expect a lot of take up there. And then this design is very open. It's a curvy open design. There's not a lot of detail in it, so I don't expect the stitching to take up a lot when it quilts out because it's not very dense. So I'm actually going to leave my shrinkage open. But if you have a very dense design or a very thick batting or even a double batting, you may want to calculate in a couple of inches for your shrinkage. So I'm leaving that open because I don't think there's going to be any shrinkage happening here. So I've got all of my numbers set the way I want them to. I'm going to come over to my full layout look. I'm going to hit this button here. And when I do that, my robotic system has calculated all of those numbers in, and this is what my quilting should look like in that space when I've got it all done. The top portion here in the little orange box is the first row that's going to stitch out. And then all of the gray rows down here are what it will look like when I've done all of my nesting and stitching. And I think that looks really nice. My spacing looks good. It looks cohesive. It doesn't look gappy or anything. So I'm pretty happy with this. I think I'm going to go ahead and get this stitched out. So I'm just going to turn this off so I go back to my singular view. I want to double check so I've got my start point on the left side and my stop point on the right side. I'm going to go ahead and go to my home button now. And I'm ready to stitch out. And as I always say, double check that you have your needle engaged. It has to be highlighted and turned orange so that you know that you are stitching and not tracing. We are going to hit our green button to get started. And of course, our robotic system is double checking with us. It's telling us it's going to move to the start of our pattern, which is our little green button over here on the left. That little circle guy, that's where our start point's going to be. Wants us to verify that our needle is up, and my needle is up. We never want our needle in our fabric when we start our machine because our machine may move and it could tear our fabric. So my needle is up. So I am going to hit my check mark. We're going to think for a second, and our robotic system is going to move over to our start point with our machine, and we're going to get going. I'm going to go ahead and let this get started for me. It's going to pull up my bobbin thread. It says pull up the bobbin thread and press OK. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to press OK. It's going to recenter over the start point and take my tie off stitches, and it's ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and let this stitch out for a little bit, and then I'll come back to you guys. All right, everybody, so we've got our first row stitched out. And as you can see here on our system, we are all set with our first row, and it is now time to get our next row started. So we are going to go to our nesting feature, which is our little hearts here on the bottom of our home screen. I'm going to hit that. And we are going to go through our directions for nesting. And I have done nesting videos previous to this, so I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm just going to go through the nesting that I need to do to get this done. So it says select and mark your nesting point. So I am going to move my machine over to kind of this low point here in the design. And I'm going to just line my needle up with some of the stitches. I'm going to double check with where I am on the screen, and I'm going to choose this as my nesting point. You can either mark this with a marking pencil, or for me, I am simply going to put my needle down in my fabric. If you choose to put your needle in your fabric to mark your nesting point, just be careful that your needle is up when you go to move your machine or start stitching so that you don't tear your fabric. So it says select and mark your nesting point. I put my needle down in my fabric at the point I want as my nesting point. Your nesting point is up to you. You determine that. I'm going to hit my check mark here. And now it says roll the quilt. So I am going to come over to my roller bars and release and roll my quilt. I'm going to go nice and slow so that I don't put any extra tension on that point where my needle is in my fabric. I want to be careful that I don't do anything to kind of stretch or tear that fabric with the needle in there. I also want to make sure I give myself enough room at the back of the head of the machine so that I don't hit my roller bar when I'm stitching, and I have enough space to kind of come up in here where the design is nested. So I want to make sure I have enough clearance here, but I also want to make sure that there's enough space out here at the front to stitch out my design. So you always want to just double check your spacing. I'm going to lock my front roller bar here. And now that I have rolled my quilt, I'm going to hit my check mark. It says move your machine to your nesting point. Well, I'm already at my nesting point because my needle is down in my fabric. If you had marked this with a marking pencil or a marking pen, you would just want to move your machine to line up with that point you marked. I'm going to go ahead and hit my check mark. And now my machine has shown me what my rows look like. My directions say move the machine to place the nested row. If you're unhappy with what your nesting looks like at this stage, you can use either of these buttons here to change the distance between your rows. And I've gone over that in a previous video, so I'm not going to go over that now. But we marked our nesting when we did our quilt layout to get it where we wanted it, so I'm happy with this. I'm going to hit my check mark, and it says nesting complete, and we are ready to stitch out our next row. Now, this is where I need to remember to pull my needle up out of my fabric before I start stitching, because we don't want to tear or drag that at all. So I've pulled my needle up, and now I'm going to go to my home button and get started. Thank you guys so much for joining me in my sewing studio today. I appreciate you guys being here. That quilt layout guide is awful helpful when you are working on an edge-to-edge design and you want to fill in that whole quilt space, get all of your rows nested the way you want ahead of time, and know that you've got complete rows to stitch out from top to bottom of your quilt without having to do any guesswork. So if it's something available on your robotic system, it's really fun to use and it takes a lot of guesswork out of things. Give it a try and see what you think. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you being here, and we'll see you soon.